Hey everybody, Jonathan Fields from Good Life Project. So I'm really excited today. My guest is Lissa Rankin. Lissa has a pretty incredible personal story of transformation and also career evolution that's taken her through the medical profession. And we're going to dive into exactly what that has been. So Lissa, it's great to be hanging out with you.
Oh, it's so fun.
We've known each other for a little while now. And in the short window, the couple of years that we've actually known each other, is pretty astonishing change in almost everything that you're doing in the world. But take me back a little bit about, you were traditionally trained physician. Bring me back in time about how you were earning your living and what your path was expected to be.
Well, I was raised in hospitals. My dad was a doctor. You know, I was called to medicine at the age of 7. So that you think like you do the normal thing, right? You go to med school, you go to residency. I was trained.
Wait. You're called to medicine at the age of 7?
I was. You want to hear the story?
Yeah.
Okay. So my parents were cleaning the chimney in our house, and the chimney sweep found a little nest of baby squirrels. They were so tiny. They had no fur. Their eyes were fused. And my mom told me the whole story, like, you know, the mom has probably left, they've been abandoned, they're probably going to die, you know, it's really nothing we can do, we just let nature take its course. And I was like, I'm having none of that. So we took the nest, and I made them take me to the veterinarian. And the veterinarian taught me how to use a little eyedropper with Espellac and dog's milk and like hand feed these little, you know, 3-inch baby squirrels. And keep them in an incubator, and I had to like set my alarm at night every 2 hours to feed them, and they had to make special arrangements at school because I had to bring the squirrels to school in a handbag with polyester fiberfill and, you know, have something to heat the milk. And so everybody was on board for like Lissa and her project, and every single one of them wound up dying. Which was heartbreaking. But I sort of got a reputation in the neighborhood as the girl that, you know, if anything happens to a baby squirrel, you bring it to Lissa. And I was living in Florida at the time, so there were a lot of baby squirrels that got injured or abandoned or whatever. So by the time I was 22, I had raised 21 baby squirrels and had been written up in the paper multiple times as the squirrel girl.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so...
So why not veterinarian school?
Because I knew all along that I wanted to do that for people, but that I wasn't allowed to do that for people until I had been trained. I mean, my dad was a physician, so veterinary medicine wasn't really on my mind. Plus, I'm super allergic to cats, so that's kind of a problem.
Okay, that would be an issue.
Yeah, exactly. But that sense of being a healer was really ingrained in me early.
So then the expression of it, it seems, was, you know, like, okay, I need to go heal people.
Right. So that's, you know, like I said, at 7, I was like, okay, I'm going to practice on animals until I'm old enough to practice on people.
Right.
So I scrubbed in on my first surgery when I was about 12. So it was an early thing. I was, you know, a candy striper in the hospital. And then I went to medical school, became an OBGYN at Northwestern, and then thought, well, this is what you do, right? I was 30 when I finished. I was 32 by the time I was a full partner in a practice. But it became very evident to me very quickly that something about the way modern medicine is practiced was out of alignment with what it meant to me to be a healer. Like, I had learned from these squirrels what it takes. You know, it takes love, it takes time, it takes nurturing care, it takes learning what the needs are and meeting those needs. And I was being taught really to be a body technician, you know, and it was becoming increasingly reductionist. Like, nobody was really looking at the whole picture. And I don't even mean like the whole picture of the body. I mean like the whole picture of life. You know,
why, I mean, where does that come from?
Where does
that approach to medicine come from? I mean, that's because I'm assuming is it a United States thing? Is it a global approach to medicine? Is it...
Well, I think it's really very, very modern. Like, it's very new, that reductionist approach to medicine. I think it came along with the technological advances that have really revolutionized medicine. You know, along with that, we have the best trauma care in the world. You know, we have antibiotics. People don't die of pneumonia anymore, hardly ever. And yet, somehow in that development of kind of gene technology and the ability to save premature infants and some of these great advances, we became so subspecialized and so focused that we sort of forgot what it was the doctors used to do, which was to go sit at the bedside and be with the family and assess the situation, like what's going on, maybe what's the root cause of this person's illness. And it became impossible to even think that way. When I started my medical practice, my first day of work, I was totally booked, scheduled with 25 patients a day. And by the time I left, 8 years into my practice, I had 40 patients a day. So I was double booked in 15-minute slots, which means essentially you have 7.5 minutes.
Wow.
So somebody comes in.
Is that pretty normal for the medical tradition?
It depends on your specialty. Because I was doing a lot of prenatal care, they just book the prenatal visits back to back to back. And then in between, you'll get a new patient, a surgical consult, and that sort of thing. So I think some of the primary care specialties have a little bit more time. But in general, if you ask around, the average healthcare visit is about 12 minutes now.
Wow.
Which is just not enough. It's just, like, you can't even begin to ask an open-ended question. Like, if you're my patient, of course I'm a gynecologist, so I don't do men, but if you were my patient, Jonathan, tell me what's going on in your life. Right? That's going to take 12 minutes there just to even listen. If I'm going to be present and let you answer that question, or what does your body need in order to heal? So we're taught to ask those kinds of open-ended questions in medical school, but when you're training, we had like what I called Be Nice to Patients class, where they'd hire these actors to come in and listen to us, give us feedback, tell us whether or not they felt like we were being nice to them. But we were given time during medical school to practice, and then in the reality, when you got out there, you weren't given time. So I started increasingly feeling like, at the end of the day, I had so much more to give than I was able to give, that I started feeling like I was selling out my own integrity. And this was increasingly happening. So I started asking if I could see fewer patients. Like, can I make less money and see fewer patients and have more time?
So were you in a larger practice with partners?
I was in a group practice,
okay.
with 5 other partners. And
right.
our practice just wasn't set up to have any flexibility around that, and I really didn't have any power over that. And I'd been asking to work part-time because I'm also a professional artist. So at the time I had 8 galleries representing my art, so I'm trying to manage this full-time medical practice and this full-time art business. And then things just weren't going well. It was clear to me that something was going to have to change, but I was scared. I was scared to change anything,
Okay, so before we go there also, professional artist and full-time OBGYN? How? I've always had that right-left brain thing going on. Like, when I was at Duke for undergrad, I was pre-med, so I was taking all my, organic chemistry classes and whatever, but I was an English major, so I was majoring in writing. And that worked well, because, I was able to, I hated my science classes. It was sort of a means to an end. It was how to become a healer, right? You got to jump through these hoops. And I loved my writing classes. But then when I went to medical school, it was like 24/7 science. I was in class from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, just doing science classes. So I signed up for art school at night. Everybody thought I was crazy. Like, what? You're a medical student. You're going to go to art school? Right.
So I was taking art classes at night. And then every free minute I had, which was hardly ever, I was painting. So I did that all through medical school and residency. And then in 2001, I had my first art show, which was at my medical office at the time. So I sold out my first art show at my medical office. And then I started working with galleries. So I was doing this full-time medical practice, and I'd come home and I'd paint until 11 o'clock at night. So
what, all right. Most people would say, okay, the practice of medicine alone is pretty all-consuming.
Yeah.
A lot of artists would say that, trying to actually build a career as an artist is pretty all-consuming. Do you have a life at all outside of this, in addition to that? Family, kids, friends, like your own body, or like...
I kind of didn't. I was married. I'm twice divorced at this point, so I'm not sure how well that was going. But I was working a lot. I was really prioritizing medicine and art, and art felt necessary at the time. I told people that medicine was my hemorrhage and art was my transfusion. Like I had to paint. I had this deep drive, and it really was my meditation. I realize that now. At the time, it looked like ambition, but in retrospect, I realized that was my healing. Medicine was killing me, and art was saving me. So it was really necessary for me at the time. But no, I didn't have any life balance. I wasn't exercising regularly. I wasn't taking good care of myself. By this point, by the time I was 33, I was on 7 medications for a whole host of chronic illnesses. I'd been diagnosed when I was 27 with high blood pressure that wasn't responding to 3 medications. I was having heart palpitations. I had severe allergies that I was on 3 medications for that weren't working. Yeah. It was, one thing after the other.
So the artist and the healer is in trouble.
It was in serious trouble, yeah.
So tell me how what happens?
So then my perfect storm hit. You know, because of course I wasn't listening to the whispers of my body. I wasn't listening to the signs from the universe. And so I got thwacked with a 2x4. And I was married to my third husband and pregnant with my daughter when my dad was diagnosed with a brain tumor that turned out to be metastatic melanoma. And he was basically given 3 months to live. So that in and of itself was like total life reframe. Like, wow, what if I found out I had 3 months to live? Here's my physician father, he's only 60, you know, and I was living for retirement. You know, I was living for the day that I was 65 and I could finally stop practicing so I could start having life. And I'd been talking for years about what normal people do. You know, like normal people take weekends off and normal people go to the gym. And I'd been sort of craving what normal people do. And so I wound up kind of really looking at my life at that point and asking myself, if I knew I had only 3 months to live, would I still be doing what I'm doing? And the answer was such a resounding, like, hell no. So I ended up giving birth to my daughter, and then my 16-year-old dog died, and then my healthy young brother, who had come out to be with my dad, who had come out to be with me because I had just had a C-section, wound up in full-blown liver failure as a rare side effect of the antibiotic Zithromax that he was taking for a sinus infection. And then my dad died, and this all happened in 2 weeks. So literally, like, we're trying to bury my dog, my brother's in the ICU, my father's in hospice in this beach house that he rented so he could die with me because I couldn't travel because I had a newborn and a scar on my belly. And it was just mass chaos. I was just starting to, like, get back on my feet about 8 months later, and my husband, was the stay-home dad for our newborn, cut 2 fingers off his left hand with a table saw and couldn't take care of my daughter, and it was like all hell broke loose. So I, you know, at that point, I was sort of looking back at all of my health issues and all of the things that were going on in my life, and I realized that, you know, when your life falls apart, you can either grow or you can grow a tumor, you know? And I just decided that it was time to grow. So one thing led to another, and it started this journey that's now been, my daughter's will be 7 in January, so almost 7 years, that began with me quitting my job, which was a massive risk. My husband had never worked since I met him. He was, you know, unemployed and kind of managing my art business and doing his own art and writing a book, and so we didn't have any financial support coming in from him. And you know, I had 2 mortgages and the boat and the fancy cars and kind of the doctor lifestyle and a newborn. So it was, plus I had to pay $120,000 for the privilege of quitting my job to pay for my medical malpractice tail to protect myself from all those lawyers out there, you know. So it was a huge decision, super scary, but it was, you know, it was one of those leaps of faith that you take because you can't not take it, you know. People ask me now, like, how do you know if it's time to take a leap of faith? And I tell them, when the pain of staying put exceeds the fear of the unknown, it's time to leap. You don't have a choice at that point. And I really felt like I didn't have a choice.
Talk to me about the conversation that goes on between you and your life partner around this decision, because it's big.
It was huge.
I mean, there's so many people that would like fantasize about doing that.
Right.
I mean, granted, maybe not for the same reasons and not without going through the same crucible, but when you have other people in your life, especially when you're like largely the breadwinner of the family, this is a big conversation.
Oh yeah, it was a massive decision, and bless his heart, Matt was so incredibly supportive. I had been asking him for years. I'd come home from work and I'd say, when can I quit my job? And he'd say, whenever you want. And then I'd come home the next day, when can I quit my job? And one day I came home, something happened at work that was really the ultimate, like, I can't do this anymore. My integrity is in serious risk.
Is this something you can share, or something that's private?
By this point, essentially by that point, I was being asked to prematurely deliver a twin pregnancy by C-section for no good reason. And this had been put on my surgical schedule. And it was, you know, when I looked at the chart, I was like, wait a minute, why are we prematurely delivering this woman? And the ICU was breathing down my neck, like the pediatric ICU, like, why is this on the schedule? And I'm like, I didn't put it on the schedule. So I went to the person who had scheduled it and said, why is this on my schedule? And she was like, don't ask questions, just do as you're told. And I was like, I'm not doing this. I'm canceling this surgery. And she's like, you cancel this surgery, you're out. I was like, great, I'm out. So it was like, ultimately at the end, it was like, I cannot stay. So it's sort of, I had been on the fence.
Right.
Because, you know, it was a good enough job. I was making a difference in people's lives. The money was great. You know, it was meaningful work. I enjoyed the people that I was working with. But in the end, it was just, I had to choose, you know. I had to choose whether to follow my heart. And I remember right before that, just a few days before that, I had been up all night, like doing a 72-hour call shift. And I had just finished at the hospital, and I was at the grocery store. And I'm trying to buy my breakfast so that I can, you know, get home and finally go to sleep. And the only thing between my bed and you know, where I was in the grocery store was this pimply teenage kid who's trying to swipe my yogurt, and he couldn't figure it out. And I remember this, I'll never forget this. I just looked him right in the eye and I said, if I did my job the way you did your job, there'd be dead people everywhere.
Oh my God.
And I was like, holy shit, I've become that asshole. Like, I've become that doctor. You know, and I'd been trained by those doctors. And I remember back when I was in residency, I was a third-year resident, and there was one night where I had to deliver 4 dead babies in one night. And it was the hardest night that I can remember from my medical years, where I would deliver a dead baby, and I would hand this dead baby to the mom and crawl into bed with her, and the two of us would sob together and like hold this baby. And then I'd have to go, my pager would go off, and I'd have to go like put on my happy face and deliver a live baby, and then go deliver the next dead baby. And it was just a heartbreaking night. And by the end of the night, after the 4th dead baby, I was running down the hallway, and I'm sobbing, and my teacher, my male teacher, is running after me, screaming, "Buck up, Rankin, you got to get a thicker skin." And I ran into the women's locker room, like fell on the floor of the locker room, and I'm just crumpled on the floor sobbing. And these 2 midwives came running in after me. And my teacher by this point is like banging on the door, like, "Open the door, get out here, you've got a job to do." And the 2 midwives are like cradling me on the ground, and they're rocking me, and I'm crying, and one of them said, "Don't ever let them break you." And I remember when I said that to that poor kid, I was like, oh, they're about to break me.
Yeah.
And I can't do that, you know? I can't be that person. So I didn't really answer your question. What did my husband say, you know? But,
No, well, yeah, I mean, powerful sort of context for the story, though.
Yeah, so he knew that. Like, he knew I was becoming that person. He could see it, you know? He'd been with me long enough at that point to...
Was that having an impact on your relationship?
You know, he literally, when I was on call, we had a vacation home that was a couple hours away. He would go to the vacation home because it was too hard to even be with me. I was so unhappy when I was so tired. And I remember just getting so depleted that, you know, I was giving and giving and giving to my patients, but I was exhausted, I was sick, and this is what you're trained to do as a doctor. You're supposed to give until you're depleted, and that's what makes you a noble doctor. You know, like in surgical specialties and surgical residencies, they say, you know, the worst thing about being on call every other night is you missed half the cases, you know? And you're supposed to have that mentality. Like, you're supposed to be bummed that you had to go home and sleep and you missed half the cases. So there's that kind of...
a lot of machismo in it.
Yeah, there is. And it's this, there's a lot of ego in it, and there's a lot of the priority is learning as much as you can, being as good as you can, and serving as much as you can, like never leaving your patients alone. So the notion of self-care is just completely absent. I mean, I remember when I was a resident, and one day I was so sick, I couldn't hardly get out of bed. But you can't call in sick when you're a resident. Like, you're supposed to be there at 4 a.m. And so I figured, well, I'll go in sick, and I look so bad, they're surely going to send me home. So I go in and I do my rounds, and I'm like on death's door, and I'm puking my guts out and having diarrhea, and I'm running to the bathroom every time. And so then it's time to scrub into surgery, and I'm thinking there's no way they're going to make me scrub into surgery. But they were like, no problem. They took me to the recovery room, hooked me up to an IV, put a liter of fluids in me, pumped me up with Phenergan, put a Depends on me in case I had diarrhea, and I scrubbed into surgery. So I then pass out in surgery, like drop the instruments in the patient's belly and pass out in surgery, and they put me on a gurney, and they take me back to the recovery room, and they give me more drugs, and then I'm supposed to scrub back in. And I remember thinking, like, this is madness. Like, this is madness. And yet it's like, if you ask any, particularly any surgical specialty, if you ask any doctor, every one of us has a story like that, or 10. So that notion of like caring for yourself was just, I was never taught that. Plus I was raised in like a family of givers. Like my family is full of doctors and missionaries.
Which is so interesting in that, if we know that one of the big things that, we'll talk about this a lot more, but sort of like in modern well care is, focus more on preventative and self-care, because that'll eliminate a lot of the need for, like the time where you actually need the care. But if the very people that are supposed to be disseminating the message are the farthest ones from actually embodying it, there's a major disconnect there. And people have got to be able to just feel that.
It's so hard. And like yesterday I was at a workshop with a group of Kaiser doctors, and even just looking around, like they feel so hopeless at this point. It's so, the healthcare system is so broken, and doctors have been indoctrinated into this for so long, and it's been so, it's just ingrained in who we are that we give until we're depleted, and that makes us noble. And I had to do a ton of work around this to get over this, because that was my mantra. Like, I give until I'm depleted, and that makes me a good person. That's my value in the world. And so when I ended up leaving medicine and getting into a different type of business, I was way over giving in my online business, and it was depleting me, and I was getting pissed off and resentful. And I remember feeling that way about my patients, like standing outside of the door when I was about to go do a delivery and having to give myself a pep talk. Like, don't be mad at this woman that she got you up in the middle of the night. Like, this is the most important day of her life. Like, show up, be present, like, be the cheerleader. Because I'd get pissed. I get pissed that I had to give up my needs.
And this just becomes your pattern no matter what you do.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really a shocking state of affairs of how things are. And I was so depleted by that point. And then, by the time I'd made it through my perfect storm, like, I had nothing left.
Right. So where do you go from there?
After the perfect storm?
Yeah.
So I wound up, this was the first time where I really started listening to like this little voice that I now call my inner pilot light. And the little voice started telling me stuff. And the first thing was, you got to get out of the city. So I was living in San Diego, and you could pass eggs to your neighbor over the balcony, and you wait in line behind 30 people to get your bagel, and it's hard to park. And LA, it started expanded when I grew up in San Diego, but it was a small little Navy town then, and it had become SoCal. So I wound up moving to the Monterey Peninsula, the unincorporated county of Monterey, on this big piece of land, and renting a house there. And when we moved there, and my plan was, I'm just going to be a full-time artist and writer. And I had no idea how that was going to work, and this was right when the economy was crashing. So I had been making good money with my art, and all of a sudden, like, that completely dried up. And so I started writing a book that never got published. It was called I Don't Do Men, Confessions of an OBGYN. And I wound up getting an agent who called it Eat, Pray, Vagina. So I now call that time, I spent 2 years in that house with my newborn and my husband, and I pretty much didn't see anybody else for 2 years. Like, I pretty much didn't leave the house except to go hiking. I just did yoga and got in the hot tub and cried a lot, and it was just a weird time. I spent most of my time writing and painting, and I now call it my waiting and becoming years, because I felt really disconnected from my calling, the one that called me at 7. I wanted to have nothing to do with medicine at that point. But I went and took a workshop at Esalen in Big Sur, which was close to where I was living. It was a writing workshop. And at the end, on the last day, the women in the group were all sitting around, and they had heard a rumor, oh, she's a doctor. She used to be an OBGYN. And so they wanted to ask me questions. So we sat around in a circle, and these women all started asking me medical questions. And I just got that glimmer of like, oh, there's something here that I've been missing. It had been 9 months, and it was sort of ironic that it had been 9 months that I had been gestating something. And there was something in that, I didn't know what it was, that was, I'm now working a lot with Martha Beck, and she talks a lot about finding your calling. She talks about finding the hot track. So that was a hot track back of, okay, there was something in that, of being in community with women, of talking about medicine but in a different way, of not being constrained by the 7.5 minutes. And the women, we were talking as a group, and then they started individually saying, "Can I talk to you privately for a minute?" So I wound up going into the corner. It was like I was Lucy, the doctor's in, 5 cents. And I sat there and I was just talking one-on-one with these people, and there was no time limit. And it was really awesome. I was like, that felt good. And I hadn't been doing that. I hadn't seen a patient or really even seen anybody else in 9 months. So I started getting a sense of like, I want to do something that gets to integrate all these facets of who I am and all of my gifts and brings together my art and my medical background and my experience working with women. And one thing led to another. I wound up not getting a publisher for my book after a year of lots of editors loving it and lots of editors taking it to pub boards because the writing was good. And every marketing department saying, "Who is she? We've never heard of her. She doesn't have a platform," Right. So it got shut down time after time. So my agent finally was like, "Girlfriend, you got to start a blog." I was like, "Blog? What's a blog?" Like, I barely checked email. And I'm like, it's not enough that I'm a doctor, artist, writer. Now I've got to be a blogger. But I did as I was told. We had this painful release ceremony of like throwing the manuscript into the ocean, like letting it go, like, okay, bye-bye book. But I never gave up on that hope that I would be a professional writer. So I started blogging, and 3 months after I started blogging, an editor approached my agent, one of the ones who had liked that first book, and said, "I have a book idea. I want your client to write it." And it was funny because thinking back, it's not a book I would have written on my own because it wasn't like the direction that the hot tracks I was following were following me away from gynecology. Because again, that felt too reductionist. It was that, like, I was much more interested when my patients were coming to me because they had PMS. I was much more interested in what else is going on in their life that's resulting in this PMS, or if they were having sexual dysfunction, like, why are they having sexual dysfunction? It's not just about what's going on in their pelvis. So, but I ended up writing a book, and so my first 2 books, my first book was about painting with beeswax, because that was the medium that I was working with in caustic, and my second book was called "What's Up Down There? Questions You'd Only Ask Your Gynecologist If She Was Your Best Friend," and that was fun to write, but again, it was a little bit of a sidetrack for where I ultimately wound up going.
And meanwhile, you're building this blog in the background?
So in the meantime, I started blogging at owningpink.com was my blog, and it started out as just me, and within 3 months I had 30 guest bloggers. And my intention from the beginning was I was going to blog about everything. I was going to blog about health and relationships and sexuality and creativity and spirituality and the environment. And I had consulted a business coach, and she was like, "You can't do that. You got to pick. Like, you got to pick your niche. Are you going to be about business? Are you going to be about health?" I was like, "No, I'm going to be about me." And my commitment, sort of what I said to my online community when I started this was, I lost my mojo. I'm going to get it back. I'm going to invite you to come along with me. And if you've lost your mojo, like, come get yours back with me. And we're going to do it by being unapologetically who we are. Just forget what everybody else thinks. Be authentic. Let your freak flag fly, and and assess all these different facets of your life. Like, what's missing from your life? What's joyful in your life? Like, where do you need to put more attention? Where do you need to, what might you need to change in your life? And so it started that way, and it very quickly got a lot of traffic. And within 3 months, I had a, Twitter following and Facebook following and a blog following, and all of a sudden the publishers were all interested in me. I was like, wow, what an interesting business. It had nothing to do with whether or not I was a good writer,
Yeah, I mean, speaks to a whole evolution in the publishing world these days. But so from there, now you're in a different place. You're speaking to women about a wide variety of things. You've got this platform. There's some sort of financial viability to it, and I want to find out where you go from there. But
there was no financial viability to it.
But you have this asset now that's drawing people to come to you.
Yeah.
But there's a lingering question, which is that those 2 years where you weren't working and your husband's not working and you got a kid. How do you survive?
How did I survive? Yeah. I liquidated my entire retirement account. So, I had been, when I was working for those 8 years, I was putting the maximum amount of money that I could in my retirement account every year. And I borrowed $50,000 from my mother, bless her heart. So we were living off of savings, borrowed money, and then credit cards. So it was a huge financial risk. And again, the whole time, like, the recruiters were going nuts. Like, come back. We'll pay you $500,000 to move to Indiana, you know, and like, come be a doctor in this underserved community. And they would come, and I finally had to just like block all the recruiters because my husband was like, that sounds like a good opportunity. Like, let's go try that, you know.
Right.
And yet there was that voice again was telling me, you can't do it. Like, you're not going back to the hospital. There's something else. There's something next. And I didn't know what it was, but my mantra during that time was, you're on the right path even though you don't know where you're going. So that's how I funded that. And then I got in this situation where I was running owningpink.com. I had employees by that point, and it was costing me an overhead about $5,000 a month to fund this. And for 2 years, it wasn't a business. I mistakenly thought that it was worth investing in that platform so that I could be a writer, and then I'd make lots of money writing books, you know.
Right.
And that didn't happen. So, you know, I write my books, and it's like, then you get this post-publishing depression of like, wow, I just spent more money hiring publicists and going on a book tour and, you know, getting the word out than I actually made on my book advance, and it's not a New York Times bestseller, and oh no, now what? So
now what?
Well, then enter our mutual friend, Chris Gilbo, right? Chris comes up to me because we were on a book tour at the same time, and he's like, what are you doing? You've got this huge online platform and you're not making any money. And then Danielle Laporte, our other mutual friend, was like, what are you doing? You know, you're sitting on a gold mine. You've got to invite your community to actually pay you something. So the two of them were awesome because they both were sort of kicking my ass and giving me some guidance on how to turn this asset. I really wasn't even thinking of it as an asset, but how to turn this asset into a business. So I wound up launching my first online course, e-course, and then that led to, I started doing one-on-one sessions. I started sort of hiring myself out as you call it what, pick your brain, or we were doing that. So I started doing essentially coaching, and then that led to, you know, another book deal with Hay House, where I started working on the book that my next book, which is Mind Over Medicine: Scientific Proof You Can Heal Yourself. And there's a whole story about how I went from What's Up Down There to that one, and
which I think I need to know.
well, there came a dark point. Oh, I missed a piece of the story, which was when I was in Monterey, I kept feeling like I was supposed to go back to medicine, but I just couldn't figure out. I knew it wasn't going back to the hospital, but I kept feeling like there was this more holistic way to practice. And the hot track on that was, I kept hearing people talk about this integrative medicine thing. And I thought, okay, well, that sounds good. Integrative, I like that word. So I started investigating integrative medicine. I looked into Dr. Andrew Weil has an integrative medicine fellowship at the University of Arizona, and I had several MD friends that had done that. So I looked into that, thought about applying for that. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll start an integrative medicine practice in Monterey. And I'll bring together all these different practitioners and kind of combine medicine and coaching and these sorts of things. And all the doors were shutting. Like, every avenue I was kind of going down was shutting. But then I got offered a job in Mill Valley, up in the Bay Area, at an integrative medicine practice. And the woman who ran the practice was so generous. When she interviewed me, she said, I want you to imagine your dream practice, and then let's see if we can help you build it here. And she was offering me the opportunity to come in and have a cash pay business where basically I get an hour with my patients. They pay me cash. It's outside of the insurance system. So by going outside of the insurance system, you can do that. When you're a preferred provider for an insurance company, you can't bill for time. You can only bill for kind of the ICD-9 codes, they call it. So this felt great, the idea of like, wow, I could have an hour with my patients. So I started working at this integrative medicine practice in Mill Valley, which Marin County, for those of you who don't know Marin County, it's like the pinnacle of health, right? Like, people there really care about their health. It's almost all of my patients were drinking their green juice, they're vegans, they're working out with personal trainers, they're sleeping 8 hours a night, they're taking 20 supplements. You're the freak if you're not doing that. Totally, like that's really normalized in Marin. And I wasn't used to that because I had just moved to Marin for this job, so I was like, wow, these people are like the proverbial choir. And what was so interesting to me was they were just as sick as my inner city Chicago patients. that I had been working with in residency.
So you're wondering, like, what gives?
I was like, what is going on here? Like, we're missing something. If these people are this sick, like, I thought this is how you get healthy, right? You eat well, you exercise, you take your vitamins, you see your doctor for regular checkups. And it wasn't working. And many of these people by this point had seen the doctors at Stanford, the doctors at UCSF. They'd gone to all, the cash pay integrative medicine doctors, the acupuncturist, the Chinese medicine doctor, the herbalist. Like, they had done everything and nothing was working. So I started asking my patients. It was really interesting because when I first started working there, I would come home and I'd tell Matt, I'm like, I'm doing something wrong, because every one of my patients starts to cry. And I would ask them things like, what's missing from your life? Or the big one was, what does your body need in order to heal? And I started asking people that question. I was thinking they'd give me treatment intuitions. Like, oh, I think I'll skip the antidepressant, maybe try the 5-HTP, But that's not what they were saying. They'd say things like, I need to leave my husband. I need to quit my job. I need to put my son in rehab. I need to finally go to art school.
And what's amazing, because the first question that came to me was, well, so many people are so tuned out to their needs that maybe they can't, but what you're saying is actually people are insanely tuned into them, but maybe just nobody's asking them, or
they knew right away.
Yeah, which is interesting because it surprises me actually, but I guess as soon as you sort of have somebody who creates the space to ask the question,
right,
it's almost like it's just below the surface.
Right. It was amazing to me. And then, of course, the next thing they'd say is, well, but I can't do that.
Yeah.
I can't leave my husband. He pays the bills. I can't leave my job. That's my security. I can't go to art school. That's impractical.
Right. Even if I'm dying.
So I'd say, well, then are you fine with staying sick? Are you cool with that? You're making a trade-off here. You've just told me what your body needs in order to heal, and now you're telling me you're not willing to do it. Is that cool with you? And then they get mad. So it started, I started getting increasingly frustrated with the integrative medicine world as well. So in many ways it was so much better because we had time with our patients. Like, the doctors I was working with were so kind. Like, they were so nice to their patients. It was a million times better than the job that I had been in before. But I kept feeling like it was still too small. Like, we were doing a much better job of not being so reductionist when it came to body parts. It wasn't just, I'm going to look at your vagina or I'm going to look at your lungs. It was, I'm going to look at your lungs and how they interact with your thyroid and how that interacts with your adrenal glands. But there was still a piece of it that I felt like we weren't addressing.
Yeah, it was still like the metrics based.
Yeah, it was, and it was still allopathic medicine in many ways. Like, instead of giving people drugs, we were giving them supplements. So it was natural medicine, which is, arguably better in many ways. But it was still, like, the message was still there's a solution outside of you.
Yeah.
So
you have to take something.
You have to come to me, and I have to diagnose what's wrong with a bunch of lab tests, and then I have to prescribe which supplements you need. And that, it was becoming increasingly clear to me, they knew what they needed to do. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about the labs I was ordering. It wasn't about the supplements. There's a piece of that. Like, functional medicine is great. There's a piece of that, of like subclinical hypothyroidism, and you're feeling tired, and things aren't going well in your life, and you give people a little thyroid and they feel like $1 million, or they have adrenal fatigue or whatever. So there's definitely a piece of that. But I was getting the feeling that was maybe 20%, and that there was this 80% other that nobody had taught me about. And I didn't really understand what it was. So I got really curious at this point. And I wound up leaving that practice and starting my own integrative medicine practice. And I was committed to, like, I'm going to figure this out. There's something here. And so my patient intake form, it's interesting because, I'm running this platinum program now that's a mentoring program where I'm working with primarily healthcare providers that are kind of looking to get outside of the system. And the intake form that I created for my integrative medicine practice is almost exactly the same as the application for my mentoring program. Because it's like a 10-page intake form that was asking people all the stuff you usually get asked by the doctor, but then I also had 10 questions about your love life, about your sex life, about your spiritual life, your creative life, your professional life, your financial life, the environment in which you live, and whether it's in alignment with your soul. So my patients would come in and be like, wow, I thought I was just going to the gynecologist, But I learned so much in that practice, and I really learned how I thought medicine should be practiced. And in doing so, I started really digging deep into the medical literature, trying to figure out, okay, if this medicine piece that I was taught is maybe 20%, then what is this other 80% that determines whether or not we're optimally healthy? And the shocking findings that I found in that became Mind Over Medicine, which is
the next book.
The next book,
Right.
yeah.
So share some of what you discovered.
Well, first off, I was really curious. You know, it all, you and I have talked about this.
Yeah.
I write what I need to learn,
Right.
you know?
I'm the same way. I'm like,
I have questions.
sweet, I'm getting paid to go actually learn
Exactly.
what I would want to learn anyway.
Exactly. So I had a series of questions, and the questions led the investigation. So the first question is, there's all these new age people talking about how you can heal yourself. You know, you got Louise Hay, you can heal your life, and all these people saying that, you know, you can say affirmations and it's going to affect the physiology of your body. You can use your mind to heal your body. And I was like, is that really true? Nobody's ever taught me that. And I've never seen any proof of that.
Right, like where's the data?
Where's the data?
Yeah.
And I was reading all these, you know, mind-body medicine pioneer books by incredible people like Dr. Bernie Siegel and Rachel Naomi Remen and Larry Dossey. And so I started reading all these books. You know, like I read Love, Medicine, and Miracles at this point, Bernie Siegel's book that sold like 2 million copies. Back in the, I think, 80s or 90s. I forget exactly when it was published. And it was fascinating. Like, I was fascinated reading it, but I kept reading it thinking, but where's the data? Like, I get this, and this is written by a doctor. So I wound up becoming friends with Bernie. And I was like, Bernie, I want to see the data. And Bernie said, you know, it's really, I'm more interested in the stories. Like, that's where I think there's so much healing in the stories. And he's right, there's so much healing in the stories. And Rachel Naomi Remen, also, her books, Kitchen Table Wisdom and My Grandfather's Blessings, like, they're incredible stories of healing. And I was so touched by these and so, like, increasingly, intuitively convinced by the stories. But there was that piece of me that's like,
Show me the data.
I went to Duke and Northwestern, like, I want to see this in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Right.
Like, I needed for myself, I needed some evidence that these stories that I was hearing were true. So that was the first thing, was like, is it true that we can heal ourselves? And I read an article in the New York Times that was all about the placebo effect. So, you know, we all know about the placebo effect. We all hear about it, and certainly as a physician, you know, it's part of the vernacular. But, you know, it's funny. It's like we've been asking this question for a long time, and the medical establishment has been proving that you can heal yourself since the 1950s. And yet we perceive the placebo effect as like a thorn in our side. It's like,
it's always the outlier.
Well, it's what gets in the way of new treatments and surgeries being approved as better than nature taking its course, right? So nature taking its course is like, that's the lowest common denominator, right? So the placebo effect means if a drug or a treatment is as good as the placebo effect, then evidence-based medicine, the conclusion says it doesn't work. Even if the placebo effect is 80%, and the drug or the treatment is 80%, then it doesn't work. And so that also started digging at me. But wait a minute, if a placebo works 80% of the time for this condition, that's pretty good. Like 80% is pretty good. Like, should
so
we
they're
be
just throwing it away because they're just focused on is it
better?
Is the pharmaceutical viable?
Exactly.
Right.
Is it going to get FDA approval?
Right.
Is this surgery any good? So I started reading all of these studies about the placebo effect. Like one of them, this guy, Bruce Mosley, he's an orthopedic surgeon. This was fascinating. So he had this great knee surgery. He was like the go-to guy for sports medicine. Like, you blow out your knee.
I've actually read the same study.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Share. This is
I was
awesome.
going to say, you feel free to tell the story.
No, go ahead.
So he had the brilliant idea of wanting to prove that his surgery was better than other surgeries. So he wound up developing a great, beautifully designed study where he had people that were getting his signature knee surgery, and then he had a placebo surgery arm where people were also getting the same like setup. You know, they're going to the OR.
Right. They think they're getting
They're awake,
right, yeah.
so it's conscious sedation. They're looking at the video monitor of like, there's their knee, but it's actually somebody else's knee that's been recorded being played on the video. And he's down there making noise and splashing and, turning on the power tools and doing all the things that you would do to make it sound like you're getting surgery. So the patient doesn't know whether they're getting the real surgery or the placebo surgery. They've signed informed consent, so they know they might get one or the other. And what they found was that the people that got Dr. Mosley's surgery got better, and the people who got the placebo surgery got better at the same exact rate. In fact, at one point in the early healing process, the people getting the placebo surgery did better than the people who were getting Dr. Mosley's surgery, probably because all they had was little
Less
incisions.
trauma, right.
Yeah, all they had was little incisions on their knee, but nobody had actually gone in and done anything, so there was less trauma. So what I found saddest about this, I read a bunch of articles interviewing Dr. Mosley, and what I found saddest about this is they asked him, so what are you going to do with your surgery now? And he said, well, clearly it doesn't work. I got to stop. And then they were interviewing all these people several years later who had gotten the placebo surgery, and their knee pain had never come back. And they said, but what do you think about this? You got a fake surgery. And they're like, I don't care. My knee pain's gone.
Yeah.
So I got really curious in that, like, what's going on there? Why are we making the conclusion that, well, it doesn't work, so we should stop altogether? And I get that if there's something that's been proven to be better than the placebo surgery.
Right.
But in this case, there wasn't.
So you're starting to find data for this, like all the claims of self-healing, the ability that, sort of like exploring the bigger thing has potential to actually create some really profound.
Well, I just got fascinated with all of this. I mean, like, there was another study. I became really fascinated, especially with the placebo surgeries, because there was something so radical about that, right? Like one of the standard treatments for angina, for chest pain, historically was a surgery called mammary artery ligation. So in this, they'd open your chest, and they'd go in, and they'd take this artery that runs under the rib cage, and they'd ligate the artery. And the theory was, if the blood isn't going through the internal mammary artery, which wasn't, necessary, then it would get shunted and bypassed. It would go over to the coronary arteries, and you'd increase blood flow to the coronary arteries. So 80% of people, their angina got better when you did this surgery. So it was standard treatment for years. And then somebody decided to do a placebo surgery, and they compared mammary artery ligation to open the chest and don't ligate the artery. And 80% of people got better. So to me, that led me down to the next question, which was, is this just happening in people's minds? Like, is it just positive belief? Is it just that they think they're going to get better and somehow they do? And if so, what's the physiology behind that? Or is there actually something physiologic happening? Like if you went into their knee and looked at it, would it get better? Like if you looked at their coronary arteries, are they opening? Like, was there any evidence that the body was physiologically, changing as a result of these placebo, groups? And what I found was amazing. Like in these placebo trials, like bronchi dilate, like men in the Rogaine trials, bald men getting Rogaine grew hair. Like
the only reason I know that is because like a bunch of years ago when my hair started jumping out of my head, I was like, should I try it? And I actually started looking at the research behind it, and I stumbled upon the placebo statistics on Rogaine. I was like, wait a minute, a whole bunch of people who took placebos actually started to have hair regrowth.
Right. That's incredible,
and
right?
it blew me away. And I'm like, really? Like you can think your hair back?
Totally.
I mean, maybe not everybody, but to a certain extent. And that blew me away the first time I realized that.
That's crazy, right?
Because that type of physical outcome had changed. I was like, wow.
Yeah, the opposite is also true.
Clearly, I never took it.
I got some sugar pills
I'm good.
for $10, Yeah, so the opposite is also true. When you look at placebo studies when people are doing chemotherapy trials, if people think they're getting chemotherapy, they lose their hair and vomit. So there's something that's real that's happening. Ulcers are healing. Like if you go in and look at colons that are getting placebos, they're less inflamed. Like there's measurable things that are happening. Warts are disappearing, So I was like, there must be something. There's something that's going on related to this positive belief that comes around thinking you're in a clinical trial and that you're getting the new wonder drug because you don't know you're getting the placebo. So I thought, well, that was the next question. Is it just the positive belief, or is there something else that's part of this placebo effect? And that's when I found the data of Ted Kapchick. He's this incredible guy who I've now been in communication with because I was fascinated by his data. He is a Harvard researcher, and he runs the program for placebo studies at Harvard. And he's basically studying placebos intentionally, because most of the placebo data is a side effect of pharmaceutical trials or trying to prove that your surgery works.
You have to track, because
you have to track since the 1950s, when we discovered that 18 to 80% of people get better when they're getting a placebo. Basically, all peer-reviewed, randomized, controlled clinical trials include a placebo arm, so that you can prove that your treatment really does work better than placebo. So he actually got curious about looking at the placebo really intentionally, and he's published many, many studies, many of them in the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association, really good, high-quality medical journals. So I started looking at his data. And he was really interested in, is it the positive belief, or is there something else? And he actually did an NPR interview, and then I asked him some questions. And he essentially was saying positive belief is a piece of it, but he thinks it's actually much more so the nurturing care of a healthcare provider, which is really interesting, right? Because then it means self-healing is sort of a misnomer. He's like, no, it's really the love. It's really that people are going to the doctor, they're in a clinical trial, they're getting tended by nurses and doctors who believe in what they're doing and believe that they're helping the patient, and that by holding that container for the patient and offering that hope, that in and of itself is happening. So to test this, he did a study where he was looking at people with irritable bowel syndrome, and he was giving them a placebo and telling them, this is a placebo, there is no active ingredients here, and comparing it to a no treatment group. And the people getting the placebo got better, even when they knew it was a placebo. So that was further kind of supporting his idea. And there's a ton of data. I had a whole chapter in Mind Over Medicine about the data proving that how your healthcare provider treats you and what they believe themselves, it is profoundly affecting outcomes. So if your doctor really thinks you have a 5% 5-year survival, that there's a 95% chance you're going to die, that is bad for you. Your outcome will actually be better if your doctor believes you're going to survive your cancer. So that was interesting to me too. So now we have these two pieces of this positive belief, this combination of positive belief and the nurturing care of a healthcare provider that's doing something to the physiology of the body. So the next question was how? How's this happening? How are you having this belief in the mind, or this thought in the mind, or this feeling that's coming from being held by a healthcare provider? And how is that mental thought or feeling or belief translating into the physiology of the body? And so that kind of fueled the next phase of my research. And what I found was that there's a lot of data suggesting that the placebo effect probably works because it turns off what Walter Cannon at Harvard called the stress response, and turns on what Herbert Benson at Harvard called the relaxation response. So when you look at that, the theory is when you're sick and you don't know what to do, the reason people are going into clinical trials is because things aren't working, right? If their medical care was working, they wouldn't need to be in a clinical trial. So they're sick and things aren't going well. So they join a medical trial. And then they get the nurturing care of healthcare providers, and they get the positive belief that maybe they're getting the new wonder drug or the new wonder surgery. And that combination relaxes the nervous system. So when the stress response is activated, the amygdala has this threat feeling, and the amygdala can't tell whether the threat is you're getting chased by a cave bear, or you're lonely, or you're worried about your health. Basically any fear-based, anxiety-based thought, feeling, or belief triggers the amygdala to communicate with the hypothalamus, which then communicates with the pituitary gland, which communicates with the adrenal gland, and then you start getting all the stress hormones, cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine. And the stress response is kicked on, the sympathetic nervous system goes crazy, you get that whole fight or flight response. The thing that I found fascinating, I didn't know this. This was one of the most shocking things that I found in my data, is that we know the body has natural self-repair mechanisms, right? if a protein breaks, the body knows how to go in and fix that protein. Like, we all make cancer cells every day. The immune system goes in and takes care of it. A foreign invader comes into the body like gets rid of it. So we know this. But what I didn't know is that those mechanisms only work when the relaxation response is in effect, when the parasympathetic nervous system is operating. So when the stress response is in charge, the body's natural self-repair mechanisms get flipped off.
Right.
Because it's not the priority. If you think you're getting chased by a cave bear.
You're just not supposed to die in the short term.
Right. It turns off your GI tract. It turns off your reproductive tract. All the blood flow is shunted to your large muscle groups and your lungs, and trying to get you so that you can run away from the threat, fight or flee. So the body isn't worried about self-maintenance or preventative care when it's in that stress response. And the body is in that, the studies show that on average, we have about 50 stress responses a day in modern society. And if you're stressed at work, if you're lonely, if you're worried about your illness.
Yeah, so you were just chronically ramped.
It's double that. Right. You're getting about 100 stress responses per day. So your body's always in this fight or flight sympathetic nervous system state where the body can't ever relax, so it can't ever fix itself.
Right.
And for some reason, if you give people a sugar pill or a fake surgery, it shuts that down. And the relaxation response...
And then you wrap it with care.
You wrap it with love. Yeah, you wrap it with love. And that combination of being held and having faith. And this, for me, is where sort of some of the spiritual side of things come in, sort of reclaiming the heart of medicine. To me, that's what being a healer is. Like, that's what I did with those squirrels when I was a child. I just loved them back to health. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but at least it gave them the best shot that they could have. By that point I was convinced. I was convinced that yes, the body can heal itself, and it has to be in the relaxation response in order for that to happen. And so the next question for me was, well, what do we do with this information? Most of us aren't in clinical trials, right? Are we supposed to go around taking sugar pills? Am I supposed to check myself into the surgery, into an operating room to get a fake surgery, so that my health condition gets better? So that was really the next phase for me, was how can I help people activate that relaxation response, turn off those stress responses, and get the benefit of the placebo effect without necessarily having to go and take a sugar pill. And I did a whole bunch of research into all the data that shows that basically doctors are using placebos against patients, without their consent, and there's a whole ethical dilemma around that.
Of course, yeah.
And I decided not to go there in the book. Like, I actually personally think it would be great if every time you go see a new doctor, they have you sign a consent form that says, if you ever think a placebo will benefit me, I agree to take a sugar pill.
Right, so it's just there.
And they can just dole out sugar pills if they think it's going to benefit you at some point, and then you've got given consent. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing sort of like full circle for you from the time that you were 7. It's like you're back to the essence. Well, and it took me back to the essence of that healer archetype, but then it also took me back to the essence of what I started blogging about. Because, again, my intention with Owning Pink was to write about, getting in touch with your inner pilot light and health and relationships and professional life and creativity and spirituality and sexuality and all these facets of what makes us whole. And as I started doing the research for this, and I was trying to find out, how do we minimize stress responses and how do we increase relaxation responses, I started looking at the data on all those facets of our lives. And I discovered, for example, that lonely people have twice the risk of heart disease as people who have a strong social network. And have you heard about the Roseto, Pennsylvania data? No. This is like one of the most fascinating stories. Malcolm Gladwell wrote about it in Outliers. Oh, okay.
So a lot of people have heard the story from then. But it was there was a study that came out of the 1960s in this town, Roseto, Pennsylvania.
Right, yeah.
That was a group of Italian immigrants that had come over, and they'd set up shop in this tiny little mountain town that was very similar to the town that they were in Italy. And long story short, basically the local doctor had discovered that, wow, it's so interesting. These people, for whatever reason, are not dying of heart disease. And he was talking to this researcher about this. They were having a beer at the local pub, and the researcher decided to look at the death certificates and determine whether that was in fact true. And it was in fact true. They had half the rate of heart disease of the rest of the country. So they figured, like, there must be something in their diet. They've got some gene. There's, they're doing something. And they found that this community, they were eating meatballs fried in lard, pasta, pizza. They're like drinking a bottle of red wine every night. They're smokers. Yeah. They're working in a rock quarry, like 12-hour days. And they couldn't figure out, like, why are these people not getting heart disease? And they were immune to many other health conditions when they started looking at them. They just lived longer. They were dying of old age. And what they ultimately concluded was that these people live in multi-generational homes. Yeah. They've got the
community is the key word.
Yeah, every day when they came home, they would have these communal dinners. They'd stop by everybody else's house, and they ultimately determined that the reason they weren't dying was because nobody was lonely. So that was huge. Fascinating to me.
And what's so funny too is like, so many people, like the aspirational track when you become successful in life and make money is to pull yourself more and more out of community.
Right.
Which is so fast because it leads to being more and more unhappy, more and more physical illness, and fundamentally it also starts to degrade performance also.
Right.
And it's so, it is really interesting when you look at all that. The work you're doing is so fascinating. We could go on for hours, actually, probably, because I want to learn a lot more about the studies. Like, I'd love to drill into all the research, the geek in me.
Well, they're all in Mind Over Medicine, yeah.
Right, exactly. So
I wrote it for the nerds.
I can't wait to dive into that and really parse it. I'm curious what your response is to this question, which I like to ask everybody as I wrap these conversations, which is, the name of this project is Good Life Project. When you think about what it means to you to live a good life, what comes up?
Well, I told you I started listening to that voice back when I left my job, that voice that I call my inner pilot light. That's just the voice of, I don't know, call it your divine spark, your highest self, your inner guidance, your inner doctor, whatever you want to call it. The minute I started listening to that voice, everything changed in my life. It was pervasive. It wasn't just my job that changed. It was like my relationships got so much stronger. My creative life became so much richer. My spiritual life became so much deeper. And all the kind of pieces of my life started falling into place in a way that I couldn't have even imagined before. And it was such a simple thing to just start to get quieter and get less busy and start trusting that voice. So to me, a good life is about listening to that voice and being willing to align your life with your personal truth and to really fully self-actualize. I think so often we wear these masks and we conform to what society wants us to be, and I did that for years, It sort of makes me sad. I have to grieve sometimes how many years I lost living that way. But the more I'm willing to have the courage to face my truth, because my truth isn't always popular, right? Like, what's true for me may go against convention. It may put me at risk of criticism. But the more I align with that truth and take action to make choices in my life, like whether it's quitting my job or writing a book like this that I'm really kind of scared about because it flies in the face of everything that I learned as a physician. So I'm a little nervous about getting burned at the stake, But the braver I get and the more I'm willing to just kind of live my life out of the box, the better my life gets, and the better the lives of the people that are important to me get. And so when it comes right down to it, I mean, really, what is a good life? It's having a life filled with love, like living with an open heart, like, having your life have meaning and purpose and being in alignment with what your soul is here on this earth to do. But I could go on about that one. I won't. I'll leave it at that.
That's beautiful. I love that. Thank you so much. It's been an incredible conversation.
Oh,
I've learned a lot. My head is spinning with things. So, my guest again today has been Lissa Rankin, the author of Mind Over Medicine, physician, explorer of the world and life. I'm Jonathan Fields, signing off for Good Life Project.